Hello, Owen. Here we are again in the beautiful Hever Castle. Thank you for talking to me today about the other Anne of Hever, of course, Anne of Cleves.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me back on your show. It's always a pleasure and so lovely to have you back here at Hever Castle.
Now, we are recording, aren't we? It's a day when it's open to the public. Now, we're in one of the hidden rooms at the moment. So where are we in the castle?
So this room isn't open to the general public. It's rarely seen on camera. And we're in Lord Astor's study. So this was always a private room. It was most likely part of the Chatelain's office during the Tudor era. And so yes, this is rarely on public display, and it's beautifully and ornately carved in the style of Grindling Gibbons from 1903 in this beautiful Sabaku wood. So yes.
Yes, and now you were telling me before we started talking, there's all sorts of hidden panels and secret doorways in here.
Oh,
so
yes.
Maybe you can show me some of those later.
Indeed.
But I was making the point that the castle is open to the public today, so that people listening to this may hear shouts of people in the background or footsteps above us, because people are looking around the castle as we speak. It's a very busy day at the end of July here, so bear with us on that. But look, I know you have a soft spot for Anne of Cleves, so maybe you can start off by telling us how she came to be living here at Hever.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a huge amount of respect for this other Anne of Hever. She's often been an afterthought, really. Certainly when I visited first in the 1980s, we had a portrait of Anne here then, and a name roomed after her. But she was very much sort of an afterthought to the more glamorous, shall we say, Anne Boleyn. You'd never find anything of Anne of Cleves in the gift shop then. But over the years, we've really tried to restore Anne of Cleves to prominence here at Hever, because she occupied this space for 17 years. Hever was actually taken as part of the Crown property after the Boleyn's downfall. So Thomas Boleyn didn't have a male heir, and therefore he willed, I suppose, his properties to his brother James Boleyn. James was of Norfolk. He was occupying Blickling at the time, and he, by indenture, traded some of the Kentish properties that he inherited for some Norfolk ones with the Crown. So Henry VIII became the owner of Hever Castle.
It's a bit ironic, isn't it, really, after everything you have to...
It is. It's quite a sort of chilling acquisition, really. I mean, he's destroyed the Boleyns at this point. He's killed Anne Boleyn, he's killed the Boleyn heir, George, and he's now sort of feasting on their spoils, as it were. But yes, he never actually lived here, and instead, after his rather disastrous and very brief marriage to Anne of Cleves in 1540, Hever became part of the annulment settlement that was afforded to her. So yes, not the best marriage in history, shall we say. I think it's been very misunderstood. There have been a lot of myths about why that marriage didn't succeed. Generally and more popularly, it's put down to Anne of Cleves' looks. I think she was actually quite a good looking woman, and that the differences they had were cultural. And I think Henry also had his eye on someone else in Anne of Cleves' employ. So yes, Anne of Cleves was gifted a number of properties. She didn't own them. They were still Crown property. She had to pay a rent for them, but that rent was paid out of the money she was afforded by the Crown. So she had no legal right to the properties. She couldn't leave them in her will. And the vast majority of the properties that she was gifted, she used to let out for further income. So there were properties across the country, really, a number in Sussex, which were slightly smaller manors that she let out and gleaned an income from. Hever, however, was one of the more prestigious properties, probably behind the Palace of Richmond and the Palace of Bletchingley, which were her favoured residences. But after Henry's death, she found herself at Hever more and more frequently. So yes, that's how Hever became the property of this other Anne.
Yes, because if I remember rightly, the Regency Council kept kind of ousting her. They ousted her from Richmond first, and then she went to Bletchingley, and they kind of ousted her there, and Thomas Cowarden took over there. So was it almost by default, therefore, that she ended up in Hever? And when would that have been, just so people can place it on the timeline?
Sure. I think we can more accurately date Anne's time here to when she transferred from being the king's sister to being the king's aunt when Edward came to the throne. It is, as you say, the Regency Council that firstly takes the Palace of Richmond back from Anne, revoking her right to lease it, and then later the Palace at Bletchingley. That really appears to have upset Anne. She was very fond of those locations, and she is offered instead Penshurst, which she refuses because she cites her usage of Hever and her fondness for it. So it's really in those latter years of her life that she is residing here at Hever. And we have a good number of sources that tell us that she enjoyed it, that she resided here and made good use of it.
Well, I'm so glad you're putting Anne back on the map here, because like you, when I first started coming to Hever, I had no idea that Anne of Cleves spent time here. It was a sort of a bit of a revelation. I can't remember it when I found that out, but I was like, oh my goodness, a second Tudor queen. But yes. You've done a lot of research on Anne of Cleves and her time here at Hever. Maybe you could try and just describe for us what the castle was like when Anne was in residence.
Yeah, absolutely. So really, the castle would have been as Thomas Cranmer left it when Thomas Boleyn had died. Thomas Cranmer came here and went through all the Boleyn's property and took the vast majority of it away. So there would have been something of an empty shell for her to occupy when she was first gifted it. But this overwhelmingly would have been the same layout as the Boleyns had it, and very, very similar to the layout that the castle is in today. So in terms of the castle exterior, very little would have changed since Anne of Cleves' time, although we do have evidence that she invested in the property. So if we imagine that we're walking through the gatehouse, this would have been a house clearly and physically divided by functionality. So to the left-hand side would have been the family wing of the castle. That's where Anne would have lived. And to the right-hand side would have been the servants' domain. And this was a functioning courtyard. There would have been 5 doors to the house, not 2 as exist today. And to get to one part of the house, the functional side, to the leisure side, you would have had to have used the courtyard. There wasn't this intertwining of the 2 wings, as it were. So yes, actually the house would, the family house, as it were, the private house that Anne actually occupied was far smaller than the castle route that you see it in today. So the principal rooms that she would have occupied would have been the room now known as Anne Boleyn's bedroom, the Books of Hours room, and the Queen's chamber, where she almost certainly slept. So,
because obviously people always ask that, don't they?
Yes.
They want to know where did whoever it was sleep. So we're talking about that solar was a large chamber that occupied, is it the east or the west? I can never remember.
West wing of the house.
The west wing of the house.
That's right.
And there was a separate bedroom to the actual kind of living space.
Absolutely. So it's actually above where we are now. The solar was so called either because it received the greatest amount of sunlight throughout the day, or it derives from the fact that it provided a private space, a solitary space, probably a mixture of the two. And So yes, this is the great chamber, the solar complex, and the best bed chamber was usually located at the end of that. So we would have had the great chamber, and then the room above, directly above where we are now, would have been Anne of Cleves' bedroom, the best bed chamber. It had a toilet, a garderobe in the corner, and also an antechamber, which is now a considerably pink bathroom. So yes, that would have been the most prestigious bedchamber, mainly because it had a fireplace. It would have been very cosy indeed. So yes, when Anne Boleyn stayed here and her family went in residence in the 1520s, she almost certainly would have occupied that bedchamber as well. So two queens have slept.
It's really mind-blowing, isn't it, to think that just above our heads right now, I can almost visualise them moving around. Yeah. Whoa! Oh, hang on to your seats. It's too exciting. What room do you think Anne most enjoyed here at Hever?
I would hazard a guess that it would be the great chamber. That really was sort of the heart of the home, the private home. Hever, of course, is a medieval castle. So when it was first built, the public and private divide really hadn't been established in the same way that the Tudors desired it later on in the period. So much more public living and communal sleeping would have gone on in the years before Anne of Cleves lived here. There was an ever increasing desire for private space, and Anne of Cleves' whole world really happened in that room. It was a multifunctional space. It was where she would have broken her fast in the morning. It's where she would have dined privately. It's where she would have read and sewn and done all sorts of things. So it was a really multifunctional space, and her later years in life were chiefly lived in that room, now known as the Books of Hours room. So I hazard a guess that would have been her favourite private space. But Anne of Cleves also did like entertaining. She was quite famed for her good feasts. So I also think she would have had a penchant for the Great Hall. But perhaps most surprisingly, I'm going to cite the kitchens, because we know in Anne's upbringing, she would have learnt cookery, quite removed to the kind of education that Anne Boleyn would have had. It was a far more domestic education, and we know that Anne is involved in cookery at her other properties. So I would say she had a penchant for cooking, and most likely did so here at Hever too.
Oh, that's wonderful. So wonderful. Just imagine her putting a penny on and going down and doing the baking to just chill out for the afternoon. That's my 21st century mind, putting a spin on it there. But do we have any evidence about how Anne felt about Hever?
So we do have letters. It's often mistaken in one of her letters that she writes to Queen Mary, that she's describing Hever as poor. She signs this letter that's congratulating the Queen on her marriage to Philip of Spain. She signs it from my poor house at Hever. This is often misunderstood as being a sign that she thought it was inconsequential or small, which it is. It's nothing of the kind. It's the modern equivalent of saying from my humble abode. Wolsey does this when he's writing from Hampton Court. He talks of his humble property, his poor property. You're going to, when you're writing to the monarch, show deference, and particularly when the property you're writing from is in their gift. So I think that's a misunderstanding that's often attributed to that statement. She has a number of letters written from the property to her brother, William, and William actually sends her hunting birds here. So we know that she is using this as a place of sport as well. We know that at least one of her ladies is married from St Peter's Church, and we know that Anne leaves funds for the poor of Hever. All of this added together, I think, gives us a flavour that this is a place that she very much enjoys. We don't have wonderful diary entries gushing about Hever, I'm afraid, but I would say the circumstantial evidence really suggests that she was fond of the property. The fact that she rebuffed Penshurst Place because she was already using Hever, I think speaks volumes about its functionality for her and her love of it.
I'd love to know all the guests that came and who came.
Yes, I know. I mean, the $1 million question is, did Elizabeth ever come and visit her stepmother here? They were very close, and at one time their lives were imperiled at the same time because of the Wyatt Rebellion and Anne's location here at Hever and its proximity to Allington Castle. So I'd love to think that Elizabeth came to visit Anne of Cleves and got to explore her mother's house. We just don't have that primary evidence that it ever happened. I wish it did. I wish we did have it. I'd love nothing more in a way. Did Elizabeth ever come inside Hever Castle? I'd love to know the answer to that question. It's one of the great unanswered questions. During her reign, of course, the property was owned by the Waldegraves, who she persecuted, so she was probably not likely to visit the property inside, but I like to think of her catching a glimpse of it on her many visits to Penshurst.
That's it's a good point, and thanks for bringing that up, because a lot of people will be wondering, surely Elizabeth would have come and seen that the place that her mother was brought up, but of course you've given us a very good reason why she probably didn't visit, so it's well worth knowing. But you talked about turbulent times, and yes, when Anne of Cleves was here, obviously there was a lot of change. We had King Edward VI, and then we had the whole succession crisis with Mary. So can you tell us a little bit about how Anne navigated through that, and did it impact her at all, and how?
Yeah, it really did. I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? The winds of change began here at Hever Castle when Anne Boleyn decided to marry Henry VIII, that set in motion that series of events that would lead to the break with Rome. And those winds didn't stop blowing when Anne died on the scaffold. In fact, they became ever more turbulent, and we have a full-on Reformation with Edward, full-on Protestant Reformation. He was brought up with Protestant minds. And then we have a counter-Reformation with Mary. So all of those winds, Anne of Cleves is having to navigate, and she appears to have been certainly, I would say, a traditional Catholic, but perhaps far more malleable in terms of compliance than other people, other of her contemporaries. Anne was a survivor. She did manage to weather the winds, but that didn't mean to say that her life wasn't imperiled at times. I don't think Edward had any of the affection for Anne that ironically Henry appears to have gained for her in the latter years of his life. But Mary and Anne did have a close relationship, and that was significantly soured when the Wyatt Rebellion took place here from Kent in Allington Castle, not 15 miles away. Kent is a notorious hotbed of rebellion, and not least when Wyatt rebelled, chiefly I would say against the Spanish marriage to Philip of Spain, amongst other issues. Now, Anne of Cleves, of course, was still in correspondence with her brother, and this led to suspicion that Anne was of the plot. I don't think Anne of Cleves had any idea of anything to do with the Wyatt Rebellion. And of course, Elizabeth is also implicated in the rebellion. Edward Courtenay, the Queen's cousin, is supposedly going to be the candidate to marry the Lady Elizabeth and overthrow Mary. And unfortunately for Wyatt, Courtney gives the game away, giving the crown the upper hand. Now, of course, Princess Elizabeth is duly taken to the Tower of London for a spell, but Anne of Cleves is never arrested. I think what is going on here is that there is to be no stone unturned during the investigation, and Anne is sort of triply damned momentarily by her location to Allington, by her relationship to Elizabeth, and also her continued correspondence with her brother and her brother's relationship with France. But I'm not even sure that Anne was ever aware of how closely her life was imperiled. We do have this letter that is sent from Hever to Mary, and it must have been really quite puzzling for Anne, because she really isn't welcome back at court after this point. She had a good relationship with Mary beforehand. She was in the chariot behind the Queen with Elizabeth at her coronation. She is still part of the royal family, but that relationship really is soured after that point, and it's quite a sad end to her life, really. I think it must have her world must have become quite small.
Yes.
After that point.
Yes, you get the feeling that she becomes progressively isolated.
Yes, yeah.
And more affected, more sad, and longing for home, maybe, towards the end of her life.
Yeah, it's not the end of the story that I would want for her. I see her as a woman of great character, of great tolerance, really, for the seismic shifts that happen during her life. This is a woman who, was born into royalty, who had great expectations for, honouring her family and for progressing and marrying well. And there's a slightly bittersweet note to her survival, in that it was never really realised in her own terms. Yes.
Well, I know that you have two portraits of Anne of Cleves at Hever, so maybe you could tell us about those portraits and what they tell us about the lady herself.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to start with the younger of the two portraits. We have a portrait that was actually created for King George I, and it's quite an interesting portrait in that it is based on the Holbein image of her, and but is rather less flattering, I would say, than Holbein actually painted her. It's quite an unforgiving portrait in that regard. And actually, I think this tells us quite a lot about the reputation that Anne gained posthumously for being a Flanders mare. This insult that's created 100 years after her death. And I think these changes in this portrait are reflective of this narrative that is built up, that Anne was ugly. I don't think she was. I hinted at this earlier. I think there were significant cultural differences between Anne and the king, and I think Henry did receive a shock when he visited Anne unannounced, in disguise, at Rochester, that first occasion. I think he had the shock of his life because he saw a genuine reaction to him for the first time. She had no idea who he was. She was watching a bullfight. She was completely disinterested when he entered the room. It had to be pointed out to her who he was. He was engaged in this art of chivalry, this notion that it doesn't matter how the king is dressed, everyone would recognise him. And his courtiers had played along with this throughout his reign. We see it with Catherine of Aragon, him dressed up and bursting into his chamber and her having to pretend that she's surprised. This is the art of courtly love that Anne is completely unaware of, And I think her disinterest in him, and then her obvious sense of horror that she has made a massive faux pas, must have translated to him as, I am not this magnificent king in her eyes that I should be. So I think the story has almost been inverted, that Anne has been made out to be the fat, smelly, ugly one in that room, when actually it was most likely Henry that was characterised as such.
It's a really good point you make, actually, that Henry might have had a mirror held up to him for the very first time in his adult life, certainly. And what a shock that must have been. That's a fantastic point, Owen. Thank you so much for highlighting that.
I think it would have been horrific for him, actually. And I think this...
Because he was way past his best by this. He was way past his sell-by date by this point.
I mean, you know, and Anne was young, and all of the descriptions we have of her say that she's good looking. I mean, we don't have people praising her beauty, but we also don't have people saying that she is ugly, that she looks like a horse. We have nothing of that. And indeed, when Henry moves on to his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, there's a good deal of evidence that Anne had hopes that he would return to her. And she complains that she is better looking and younger than Parr. And Chapuis agrees with her that Anne is the fairer of the two. So, and we know that Catherine Parr was good looking. So I think it's really unfair that her whole story has been boiled down to this myth, and that portrait, that later portrait, is reflective of that myth. The other portrait is 16th century. We don't know whether it was painted in Anne's lifetime. We need to have more analysis done on the panels in which it's painted on. But it's a beautiful portrait. It's one of my favourite here at Hever. And it really shows, again, those cultural differences. She's dressed in a very different fashion to the French or the English one. And her dress is stunning. It's covered in seed pearls. And I think it shows a very humane face, a very engaging one. And yes, one that I would very much like to sit down and talk with, really.
Yes, I always say she's the one you would like to have a coffee with.
Yes.
If you could sit down with one of Henry VIII's wives.
I'd love to come for a house party with Anne of Cleves.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, you'd be well fed.
So, yeah, absolutely. So maybe we should just wrap up our conversation. It might be a good way to end by just saying, so how should we remember her? We're trying to debunk this myth once and for all. So, Owen, how should we remember Anne of Cleves?
I think she was pragmatic. I think she was another woman who made the best of a bad situation. I do like to think of her as a survivor. She outlived all of the wives, and she outlived Henry. She outlived his heir. But I think it is important to temper that by understanding that she did not live her survived life on her own terms. And I think there was a degree of disappointment and restraint placed on her life. And I think it's also important to remember that her largesse at the behest of the crown was entirely contingent on her restraining her life here in England, not remarrying, not having children. The moment she contemplated doing any of those things, everything went. She wasn't a prisoner, but she also didn't live the life she was supposed to and perhaps wanted. So I think it's important to recognise that too.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing your love and your knowledge all about Anne, particularly here at Hever Castle. Thank you, Owen.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.